Hey, what's going on, guys? Remote Gaming here, back with another video. In today's episode, we're taking a look at the Blood Death Knight, and I've kind of come in here to Wowhead, and I've changed up all the little tiles here that you can click to make sure that everything is accurate here between this list and the below list. And what we're going to do is just kind of run through our rotation, our priority, and it's broken out between Dancing Rune Weapon and during Dancing Rune Weapon and outside of Dancing Rune Weapon. So we're going to cover each section in as much detail as we possibly can, and we'll kind of hop back and forth in between that list and some of the different talents here in our tree. And we will also put an import string in the description of the video as well if you want to import these talents. So let's go ahead and get started here. So your number one priority outside of Dancing Rune Weapon will be to not let your Bone Shield drop, and you can keep this up through your Marrow Rend. This will apply basically more charges to your Bone Shield. This is very important because Bone Shield gives us a ton of armor, and if this ever falls off, you'll become extremely squishy. So this is always going to be your number one priority, is keeping charges of Bone Shield up. So if we go over to our talent tree, we can see that we have a lot of synergy with Bone Shield. You can see we have like Bone Collector, the talent here, so whenever you pull an enemy to you, that's going to grant you 1 charge of Bone Shield. And another thing that's pretty core to us is Bone Shield increases your haste by 10% through improved Bone Shield. So this is very important because haste means the more runic power you can generate by spending runes, and basically the more spells that you can cast, the more healing that you can do, the more survivability that you have. So it's very important to keep your Bone Shield up at all times. And we do have some other talents down here that we'll kind of talk about later as we dive a little bit deeper into Bone Shield and kind of how it works. For now, let's go ahead and move on. We also have Abomination Limb, which is on a 2-minute cooldown, and basically you press it and it sucks a whole bunch of enemies into you, which is very key in a lot of specific boss fights. One that kind of comes to mind is the second boss fight on Necrotic Wake. Basically, all the adds that spawn, you can Abomination Limb, grip them all into you, and kind of cleave them down very quickly and efficiently. And then one thing to note about this is it will also give you 3 charges of Bone Shield. So that's pretty nice if for whatever reason you do drop below, let's say for example, 5 Bone Shield charges. We haven't really talked about that yet, but through the Ossuary talent here, if you are above 5 Bone Shield charges, your Death Strike is reduced by 5 runic power. That's going to be one of the main ways that you heal. And you can use Abomination Limb to kind of spike up your Bone Shield charges very quickly. So typically what you want to be doing is you want to make sure you're staying above 5 Bone Shield charges. Use Marrow Rend to keep those stacks up above 5, and you'd be basically using Dancing Rune Weapon with Abomination Limb. Now another talent we have here that we haven't really talked about yet is Bone Storm. Now if we look at Bone Storm here in the talent tree, there are no other talents that synergize with it. It is on a very short cooldown, a 1-minute cooldown, and this will consume your 5 Bone Shield charges to create a Whirl of Bone that batters all nearby enemies, so it'll do a bunch of AoE damage, and this will heal you for 2% of your max health every time it deals damage up to 10%. So this will consume those charges, and it will also regenerate a whole bunch of Bone Shield charges as well, and this lasts 2 seconds per Bone Shield charge spent. So the more charges you have, the longer it lasts, essentially. Now one thing we haven't talked about yet is Death and Decay. So let's go ahead and read this node directly above Bone Storm. When Bone Shield is consumed, it shatters, dealing X amount of attack power shadow damage to nearby enemies. This damage is tripled while you're within your Death and Decay. So if you remember from Bone Storm, essentially what we're doing is we're consuming those Bone Shield charges, and then through Shattering Bone, there is a whole bunch of burst damage that kind of goes out, and it's actually tripled if we're standing within that Death and Decay. So you want to be casting Bone Storm only if you are within your Death and Decay. So Bone Storm becomes a high priority item for us if we are within our Death and Decay, and Dancing Rune Weapon is on cooldown, and we have 5+ Bone Shield charges. And we see here when used, it will refund those 10 Bone Shield charges over the next 10 seconds. Then another talent we haven't talked about yet is Consumption, and you're going to be pairing this essentially with your Dancing Rune Weapon. So whenever these 2 cooldowns line up, you're going to be using them together. And Consumption's on a 30-second cooldown here. Strike all enemies in front of you with an attack, dealing percent physical damage, and heals you for 150% of that damage. Deals reduced damage beyond 8 targets, and then causes your Blood Plague damage to occur 30% more quickly for 6 seconds, and it generates 2 runes. So a very strong button here. And we want to cast this with our Dancing Rune weapon because Dancing Rune weapon, of course, will duplicate this for us. Now, step 6, we have Death and Decay. And we've talked about Death and Decay a few times, but not super in depth. So let's go ahead and cover this real quick. So through Death and Decay, right, you put it on the ground. It costs a rune, and essentially it's going to basically apply Cleaving Strikes as a buff for us. So if we look at the blood section here, Heart Strike hits up to 3 additional enemies while you remain in your Death and Decay. When leaving your Death and Decay, you retain its bonus effect for 4 seconds. So what the heck is Cleaving Strikes? It's right here under our Death Knight tree. Heart Strike hits up to 3 additional enemies while you remain in your Death and Decay. When leaving your Death and Decay, you retain its bonus effects for 4 seconds. So you can kind of weave in and out of your Death and Decay and maintain this Cleaving Strikes buff. You want to make sure that this is always up. Now, step 7 here, we are also running Soul Reaper. So let's take a quick look at what Soul Reaper is. That's going to be under our Death Knight tree. 6-second cooldown here. Strike an enemy for some damage. After 5 seconds, if the target is below 35% health, this effect will explode, dealing an additional amount of attack power, shadow frost damage to the target, and some mumbo jumbo there at the end. Essentially, nothing in terms of survivability here, but this will do a decent amount of damage considering that is on a 6-second cooldown. So as mobs start to kind of enter that 50% health threshold, you can go ahead and start Soul Reapering, kind of tab targeting in between the mobs, and this huge sort of chain detonation will go off and deal a whole bunch of damage. It is on the 6-second cooldown though, so you can't just spam it, but it is short enough to be a fair amount of damage. Then number 8 in priority, kind of after we get through this sort of initial burst phase, all of our cooldowns out of the way, your next priority is going to be maintaining that 5+ bone shield charges. Then everything down here does kind of get a little bit more redundant because it's kind of the core rotation here, stuff that we kind of already talked about. Let's jump down to step 10 here though. Use Tombstone if the following conditions are true. You will gain more than 20 seconds of cooldown reduction from Tombstone on Dancing Rune weapon. You'll consume 5 bone shield charges. Or step 3, you are currently standing in your Death and Decay. So let's figure out what Tombstone even is first. So 1 minute cooldown, consume up to 5 charges. For each charge consumed, you gained 6 runic power and absorb damage equal to 6% of your maximum health for 8 seconds. And we do not have any talents in our tree that synergize with this, but you want to make sure that you're sitting on 5 bone shield charges before you press this button. And this has a very similar effect to our Bone Storm, right? This consumes those bone shield charges. So going down to step 3 here, you want to make sure that you are always in your Death and Decay when pressing Tombstone or pressing Bone Storm. So my best advice is with Death and Decay to get some sort of weaker that tracks whether or not you are moving in and out of your Death and Decay. Whether you're actually standing in it or not, it can be kind of hard to judge when there's a whole bunch of mobs on top of you to kind of see where that ground effect is. So, very similar to something like Mistweaver Monk. They have one for Jadefire Stomp. They also have one for Death Knight. So make sure to download a weaker for that and ensure that you are always standing within that Death and Decay. Okay, now we're finally getting into runic power. How do you want to spend your runic power? You're going to be spending this on Death Strike. And the guide here kind of recommends 75 runic power, and the reason for this is because this is going to guarantee that you have a backup Death Strike in case you get a big burst of damage after casting it. And then also enough to where you don't accidentally overcap on runic power if you just get like a big certain burst of runic power from a specific ability. And then you can also use your Death Strike to keep 5 stacks of your, I'm just going to call it the Coag buff. The stacks up to 5 times. And each time you do Death Strike, you do get another stack of this. So I recommend getting another weaker to track this as well. Not going to be really hard to keep up though, to be honest, because we're Death Striking so much in our rotation. And then another thing we haven't talked about yet is Blood Plague. So this is applied through our Blood Boil. So this is works off like a charge-based system. You get 2 charges of it. So you need to make sure that you're just kind of looping that into your rotation to keep that Blood Plague up. As you heal a lot from that Blood Plague, that disease drains health from the target to you to heal you. And then finally, we'll be using our Heart Strike here to consume any additional runes if there's nothing else to press. Remember, we want to consume runes for more runic power so that we can funnel that into our Death Strike. So very important to keep those runes recharging. So this is the priority outside of Dancing Rune Weapon. Let's quickly talk about inside of Dancing Rune Weapon. Okay, then during Dancing Rune Weapon, everything down here, like the bottom half, stays the same. The only thing that changes is pretty much the top half of this priority here. And I do think that there was something that was kind of left out on this guide. When you select Abomination Limb, nothing happens here. And in this above section, it said that you want to pair Abomination Limb with Dancing Rune Weapon, and it's not in the Dancing Rune Weapon section, so I think they might have just accidentally left this out. I could be wrong there. Feel free to correct me in the comments, but I believe you want to be pairing your Dancing Rune Weapon with your Abomination Limb when you can. So steps 2 and 3 are pretty much saying the same thing here. You want to make sure that at the end of your Dancing Rune Weapon, you are casting a Marrow Rends, and the reason for this is because we want to get back up to those 10 Bone Shield charges, and we want to make sure that we're not using Marrow Rend with Bone Storm, mainly because Bone Storm is going to give those charges back to us as Bone Shield charges. So if you have Bone Storm running, you don't need to cast Marrow Rend here, because Bone Storm is just going to give us those charges back for free. And then from here, we'll want to be casting our Consumption. This is one of our strongest cooldowns. It's on a 30-second cooldown. So I'll also be generating those 2 runes for us as well. And then from here, we want to set up that Death and Decay and that Bone Storm window. So we'll get Death and Decay down, and we'll follow that up with a Bone Storm. Again, utilizing Shattering Bone here. And then, yeah, I mean, that's pretty much it. And it looks kind of complicated here, but for the most part, you know, these first 6 or 7 steps is really what you're following. And then steps 8 through 13 are going to be the exact same thing as steps 7 through 13 here. There is 1 step of difference, and that difference is going to be step 9 here. Use Dancing Rune Weapon on cooldown, which is something that you're only going to focus on outside of the Dancing Rune Weapon cooldown window. So that is pretty much it in terms of the rotation. Once again, these are the talents that we are running. I will leave an import string in the description of the video. Let me know what you guys think about this sort of format of video here. I know I didn't cover absolutely everything, just trying to kind of cover the core things here. But yeah, if you guys enjoyed the video, please consider liking and subscribing to the channel. See you on the next one.